You're in a pickle heading into week 2 of the fantasy season. This is the video for you because we're going to break down our top sneaky options for week 2 of the fantasy season and go over the best streaming options at the quarterback and tight end position. All right, we're going to start the video off with Cedric Tillman of the Cleveland Browns, currently sitting at 46% rostered and finished last week with 16.2 fantasy points against the Cincinnati Bengals, 8 targets, 5 catches, 52 receiving yards, and a touchdown. And I'm a little bit surprised that Tillman's only sitting at 46% rostered. I mean, I know it's early in the season. It's difficult to make those kind of, decisions when you're dropping players from your roster. We don't want to overreact, but I feel like Tillman is a very good flex option going into week 2. We talked about him in the nuclear video. I think this is a sneaky player overall for the week, and I don't see how, with him sitting at such a low roster percentage, we can't talk about him at top of the sneaky starts video. If you are in a bad position, if you have a player who is out last minute due to injury, Tillman may be out there on the waiver wire in over half of leagues right now. You can pick him up, plug him in. He's a great play going up against the Ravens here in week 2, who gave up the second most fantasy points to wide receivers in week 1. I know a lot of people look at this Ravens defense and they think that is a good defense. This is not a good matchup. I talked about it all going into week 1. It's a good defense on paper, if this was Madden, but this defense is not that great except for stopping the run. And even in week 1, they couldn't hold back James Cook and Josh Allen. But, the Browns are not the Bills. I'll say that much. But still, this is a good matchup. And this secondary gave up a tremendous amount of fantasy points to the wide receiver position last year as well. We know that Joe Flacco, who threw the football 45 times in week 1, is going to come out here slinging it. Tillman was tied for the second most targets on this team in week 1. Don't really see that changing in week 2 in a game script where the Browns are going to be forced to throw the football. So Tillman, very sneaky, probably still out there, and is a player that you guys can pick up and plug in, and that I think that he's a player we will talk a lot about going into Sunday's action. All right, another player popular out there on the waiver wire this week was Kayshon Boutte of the New England Patriots, who had a very good week 1, 16.3 fantasy points, 8 targets, 6 catches, 103 receiving yards. And in week 2, we'll be traveling to face the Miami Dolphins, who just gave up an incredible performance to Daniel Jones and company in week 1. Now, saw Michael Pittman have a good game. Tyler Warren at the tight end position have a good game. It wasn't really a crazy day for pass catchers, but then again, the Colts just didn't even really need to throw the football in the second half. So we'll see how this game script works out, but we look at the breakdown of the wide receivers for the Patriots. We saw Boutte with 8 total targets, Stephon Diggs with 7 targets, and then Demario Douglas also with 7 targets, and then worth mentioning, Hunter Henry also had 8 targets. So once again, we have Boutte tying this team for the most targets going into week 2, or at least in week 1, right? So, I will say he's on the injury report with a shoulder injury, but everything I've read is trending towards him playing on Sunday. And this is a player, once again, he's just sitting at 37% roster. I saw him added in a lot of leagues, but he's still out there and available in a lot of your guys' leagues. So if you're in a position where you need to plug in a player last minute, I think that Boutte could be really sneaky this week and a great matchup against the Dolphins. We look at week 1, Drake May threw the football 46 times with 30 completions. I was expecting this to be a much run heavier offense, and there's still room for that, but we only saw 12 total carries combined between Trayvon Henderson and Ramondre Stevenson in week 1. So we'll see how the game script works out here. If the Dolphins can fight back a bit, if they can, I think that's very good for a player like Boutte. If not, I think he can still do enough damage to come out with a good fantasy stat line at the end of the day. So once again, we have a low rostered player that you guys can pick up and could be sneaky here in week 2. Surprisingly, we're going with a couple Browns players in today's video. Next up is Dylan Sampson at the running back position. Week 1, 17.3 fantasy points, just 29 yards on the ground, but 8 targets, 8 catches, 64 receiving yards for Sampson, and a nice fantasy outing with 17.3 PPR fantasy points. And we know that Quentin Junkins is now likely to play in week 2, questionable for week 2. Obviously, he wasn't out there week 1. And Jerome Ford had 1.3 yards per carry and 1 catch for -3 receiving yards. Did absolutely nothing at the running back position, but I'm not really worried about Junkins coming in here and just, automatically being the guy. And once again, in general, I'm not worried about him being the guy, because my argument for Dylan Sampson in week 1 was that he would be a potential pass catching running back, and that's exactly what he was. So I think Judkins can come in here, take over Jerome Ford's role as the true 3-down back, and maybe that takes some touches away from Dylan Sampson, but I still think he will get his involvement in the passing game, which is, I think, maybe all that matters for Dylan Sampson. And once again, this is a good game script. Ravens 25th against running backs in week 1 in terms of fantasy points allowed. And I think that the Browns will be forced to throw the football in this matchup, so that at the end of the day, Dylan Sampson's role could be retained here in week 2, no matter what. And it gets a little bit tougher as they face Green Bay, Detroit, Minnesota, Pittsburgh in the next coming weeks. Kind of a mixed bag in week 1 for most of those teams, maybe outside of Green Bay in terms of what we can expect defensively. But still, Dylan Sampson in these game scripts where the Browns are going to need to throw the football, which is probably going to be most of these game scripts, he will have fantasy value. I think this is a player, he does sit at 72% rostered, but he's a player who could end up at a much higher roster percentage due to that pass catching ability over the next couple weeks. So if you own him and you're hurting at the running back position, I think he is a fine, sneaky start here in week 2. Let's get to our quarterback and tight end streams for the week. If you own Justin Fields, he's shot up to 81% rostered after having 29.5 fantasy points in week 1, 218 passing yards and a passing touchdown through the air, 2 rushing touchdowns, 48 yards on the ground. He may not be a player that you're considering a streamer at this point anymore, but I do think in a lot of leagues, Fields either went undrafted or you got drafted as a QB2 in a late round, and you have another quarterback in front of him potentially. And my point for him being in this video is that he should not really be a streaming option. But we went back, to last week's, waiver period. Initially, he was sitting around 61% rostered, and obviously he shot up to 81% rostered. So this may still be a quarterback some people are viewing as a kind of streaming option. But here in week 2, after a monster performance against a good Steelers defense on paper, he gets the Bills, and this is a defense that got absolutely shredded by Lamar Jackson and company in week 1. Zay Flowers had a big game. Obviously, Derrick Henry had a big game. Ultimately, this is a good spot for players like Justin Fields, like Breece Hall, like Garrett Wilson, like we've talked about throughout the course of the week, and ultimately a defense that gave up a lot of fantasy points to the quarterback position in week 1. Now, Fields is not Lamar Jackson, don't get me wrong, but his play style, at least somewhat emulates what Lamar Jackson does, just not at that exact level, right? So this should be another huge week for Justin Fields. And I talked about this going into week 1. I didn't love the matchup against the Steelers, but this upcoming stretch for Fields is huge. The Bills, the Bucks, the Dolphins, the Cowboys, Denver, tough in week 6, but then the Panthers and the Bengals. So even if you didn't start him in week 1, which he obviously performed in week 1, you got to feel good about this upcoming stretch for Justin Fields. And he is really my must-start streaming candidate at the quarterback position here in week 2. But like I said, for most of you guys, I don't think you're viewing him as a streaming option moving forward. All right, let's move to a true streaming option. That's going to be Michael Penix at the quarterback position, sitting at just 43% rostered. He had 24 fantasy points in week 1, 27 of 42 throwing the football, 298 passing yards through the air and a touchdown, 21 yards on the ground and a rushing touchdown as well. This week he will travel to Minnesota to play the Vikings, who just gave up the 24th most fantasy points to quarterbacks in week 1 against Caleb Williams. And I like this spot for Michael Penix. I think he could quietly kind of emerge over the next couple weeks before an early week 5 bye week as a player who kind of just turns into a viable starter on a weekly basis in fantasy. Minnesota this week, it's kind of a mixed bag with what to expect out of this defense. They didn't look as good in the first half. They adjusted, played better in the second half. We know that this is still a very good system, even if this defense looks like it has some holes compared to last year. But then Panthers, Washington, Commanders in week 4. There's definitely going to be some opportunities here. I think that Michael Penix can start to put together a really nice fantasy season. Obviously, the wide receivers being hurt right now, Drake London, Darnell Mooney, maybe that impacts things a little bit in terms of upside, but it looks like London's going to be good to go for Sunday, and Mooney's been cleared as well, but those shoulder injuries still make me a little bit nervous at the end of the day, but he does have weapons around him. Kyle Pitts looking okay. Bijan Robinson, obviously. So Penix showed some rushing upside in week 1. That's the biggest thing here. I think this is a good matchup in week 2 on Sunday Night Football as well. So if you are looking for quarterback help, you're desperate last minute, Brock Purdy was your quarterback, whatever, Penix definitely a very good streaming option here in week 2. And let's stick with that same matchup and take a look at JJ McCarthy, who had 23.2 fantasy points in week 1, was 13 of 20, 143 yards and 2 touchdowns through the air with a pick. Not great there, but he did add 25 rushing yards and a rushing touchdown. And ultimately, he got the fantasy points. He rallied this team in the second half. And it's a good matchup this week against the Falcons, who finished bottom 10 against the quarterback position in week 1 against Baker Mayfield and company. And then he gets another good matchup in week 3 against the Cincinnati Bengals. And JJ McCarthy, similar to Michael Penix, is a player that I think could kind of start to become a viable fantasy option as the weeks start to progress here, who need to be on the streaming radar, but could turn into something bigger, kind of like a Bo Nix early in last season. Maybe they won't, both finish in the top 8 or whatever, but these guys could definitely be top 12 quarterback options as the fantasy season progresses. I will say there's obviously some flaws here. JJ McCarthy's early play in this game, but still, there are enough weapons around him and guys like Justin Jefferson, TJ Hawkinson, even Adam Thielen and the 2 running backs on this team. I think it's enough for now. And once Jordan Addison rejoins his team after week 3, I think it'll certainly be enough. Just remember, this Kevin O'Connell system, this offensive system is made to throw the football, to play to the strengths of the quarterback. He's done all kinds of things with guys like Josh Dobbs and Sam Darnold, reviving Kirk Cousins. I think that JJ McCarthy is going to be a very good quarterback in the NFL. And I think that ultimately he could also walk into a lot of good fantasy opportunity. And I like this matchup quite a bit here in week 2. So if you need help at quarterback, McCarthy sits at 63% rostered. He is an option for you. Let's move on to the tight end position, and let's take a look at Jonnu Smith, who had 12.5 fantasy points in week 1 against the Jets, 6 targets, 5 catches, 15 receiving yards, and he did find the end zone. He sits at 55% rostered, and he gets a monster matchup in week 2 against the Seattle Seahawks, who gave up the most fantasy points to the tight end position in week 1. Not just George Kittle, but Jake Tongues as well. So they're not just giving it up to the number 1 tight end. They will allow points to the number 2 tight end. So maybe look out for Pat Freiermuth in this matchup. But in all seriousness, I did think Jonnu Smith was being kind of undervalued at the end of draft season, then kind of overlooked going into week 1. And, he did come through here with a nice stat line. Now, you take away the touchdown, what is really here? Basically nothing, but you could say that about a lot of tight end performances on a weekly basis. And what we do know is that in this Arthur Smith system, he's going to be utilized. Arthur Smith loves Jonnu Smith, right? And it was nice to see Aaron Rodgers give him 6 targets, because Aaron Rodgers doesn't really traditionally have a huge connection with the tight end position. Worth noting, Freiermuth had 3 targets, 3 catches in week 1 as well. But the main thing here is he only sits at 55% rostered, had a nice week 1, found the end zone, and now he gets a golden opportunity and a very good matchup at home. Steelers' first home game this year against a team that just gave up the most fantasy points to tight ends in week 1. So if you need help at the position, Jonnu Smith is certainly a viable option. Except we have none other than the strange man himself, Brenton Strange, going up against the Bengals in week 2, finished bottom 5 against the tight end position, and he just had 9.9 fantasy points in week 1, 4 targets, 4 catches, 59 receiving yards. He led the Jaguars in receiving yards in week 1. Not Travis Hunter, not Brian Thomas Jr., Brenton Strange. And we do know that historically, Trevor Lawrence likes to target the tight end position. This was part of the theory for taking a late round swing on Brenton Strange, with what we've seen with the healthy Evan Ingram with the Jaguars in previous years from Trevor Lawrence. And I guess healthy Trevor Lawrence as well. So I think that the volume could certainly be here for Brenton Strange. I don't know that he'll necessarily lead the team in receiving yards again this week, and I expect things to get much better for Brian Thomas, and I do expect Travis Hunter to continue to have a role in this offense. But I think that Brenton Strange will also continue to have a role in this offense, and this is a very good matchup in week 2 against the Bengals, and he sits at just 38% rostered. So that's all you really need to know. Volume was there in week 1. The production was there. The matchup is here in week 2. And ultimately, if you need help at tight end, Brenton Strange could certainly be that guy. Last but not least, we have Hunter Henry of the New England Patriots, finishing with 10.6 fantasy points in week 1, 8 targets, 4 catches, 66 receiving yards. And he gets a stellar matchup as well against the Miami Dolphins, who gave up the 27th most fantasy points in week 1 to the tight end position, giving rookie Tyler Warren 14.9 fantasy points in week 1. And I talked a lot about Hunter Henry as a viable streaming option in week 1 at the tight end position. Had 8 total targets like we talked about earlier in the video. I mean, that is pretty high in terms of target share here, as he tied with Kayshon Boutte for the most targets on this team in week 1. And Drake May just views Hunter Henry as a true security blanket option, player that he can get the football to quickly and often and trust him. And Drake May threw the football 46 times in week 1. This is a great matchup against a bad Dolphins defense. I mean, it's early in the season. Like, we can't declare anything really, but the Dolphins look like the worst defense in the NFL in week 1. Patriots should have a good day here. It's a big divisional game. They're going to try and do whatever they can to put up some points against the Dolphins. So if you need help at tight end, Henry sits at 46% rostered. He is a strong streaming option here in week 2. There you guys have it. There are my sneaky starts and streams for week 2 of the fantasy season. If you guys are new here, this is all we do here all year long. Free fantasy football content, redraft, dynasty, and best ball. If you guys are into that, be sure to subscribe on the way out. And while you guys are down there subscribing, be sure to drop me any fantasy football questions whatsoever. I will answer every single comment on this video as soon as I can. Really does help me out if you guys hit that subscribe button as well while you're down there. And when the playlists pop up on the screen whenever they come up, make sure you guys check out all of our videos for week 2 of the fantasy season. We'll have everything on the channel you could possibly need to dominate week 2 of the season. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.